There are two ways we describe and measure level, and to help us understand how compression works, we need to understand them. They're called peak level and average level. Peak level is the instantaneous measurement of level. It's important because it lets us know the highest level of the audio and how close it is to the ceiling, or the maximum allowable level, before distortion. Average level is a measurement of the average energy that occurs over a window of time. We typically use a window of about 300 milliseconds, or 1/3 of a second. This is connected to the way our brain evaluates the level or loudness of a sound. When you look at the waveform of a recording, you can usually see the peak and the average level pretty clearly. If you zoom out and look at an entire song, you can even navigate the different sections by interpreting the difference in average level between the verse and the chorus, or the soft and the loud sections, as it goes along. When peaks are very high compared to average level, we can use compression to control this. Sometimes we call that relationship peak to average ratio, or crest factor. By reducing the peak to average ratio, we can raise the signal and achieve a slightly higher average level. That is why compression is associated with making things sound louder overall, but it's actually doing this by reducing or compressing the louder sounds to manage the difference between loud and soft.
So let's talk about loudness then. So how do we perceive loudness? Really, when we talk about loudness, what we're talking about is the way that our auditory mechanism, the way that our brains perceive loudness. And that's a result of a number of different factors that we need to understand. So the auditory mechanism, the brain perceives loudness more in terms of average level over periods of time and not as instantaneous level. Okay, so very short, loud peaks. So, something that's a few milliseconds long, that's extremely loud in terms of sound pressure level, will not appear loud to us, whereas a more sustained sound will appear to be louder because it's building sound pressure level over a longer period. So there is an audio measurement system called root mean square, or RMS level, which corresponds a lot more to how our ears perceive loudness. And you'll see the RMS unit used in a lot of different audio equipment. So sustained levels increase loudness, and then importantly, our ears have a different level of sensitivity to frequencies across the spectrum. And so our ears are particularly sensitive to frequencies within the mid or the high mid frequency range, which is where all of our speech intelligibility comes from. So a mix that has a lot of energy in the high mid frequency area tends to sound a lot louder than a mix that has less energy in the high mid frequency area, even if they are metering the same technical level. Track A with lots of high mids will sound louder than track B that has less. Contrary to most people's expectation, tracks with lots of bass frequencies in them don't actually sound that loud. It's mostly the energy that's in the high mid frequency range that tends to push a little bit more this sense of perceived loudness. So there are a bunch of different standards that are used to describe or measure loudness, and the one that is most commonly in use in the audio profession is this one called loudness units. So we have a scale called loudness units full scale. We call it LUFS for short, which is average of level over a specified time period, and there is a technical paper that describes how LUFS are calculated if you have that interest. But essentially it's average level over a specified time period that corresponds quite closely to our perception of loudness. So two tracks that have the same LUFS reading or the same LUFS level should sound equally loud. And that's a really important concept. So LUFS is a unit that's used to express loudness levels on an absolute scale, and it's expressed as a negative number. So just like decibels full scale for digital level, for example. So 0 is our maximum, and then LUFS are expressed as a negative number underneath maximum. So according to that scale, something that's minus 10 LUFS is louder than something that is minus 12 LUFS, for example. So then you have just LU, or loudness units, which can be used just to describe the differences between loudness levels. So if we have a track that's minus 23 LUFS, then we can say that's 2 loudness units, or 2 LU quieter than a track that has loudness of minus 21 LUFS, for example. And then when we look at dynamic range, which is the difference between your softest sound in that track and your loudest sound in that track, then we can express that dynamic range also as LRA, or loudness range. So that is the difference in loudness units between the softest and the loudest part of the track. So loudness and dynamic range have a relationship to genre. So most people are aware that classical music has an extremely wide dynamic range, from the pianissimo sections right through to the fortissimo sections of an orchestral work. It's huge. Most of you have probably had the experience of putting on a classical music CD and setting a listening level, and then finding that the loud section, the fortissimo section, comes through and you're diving for the volume control to turn it down because it gets super loud. Or likewise, that the soft sections of the piece disappear under the ambient room noise and you can't hear them properly and you need to turn it up. So that's all an indication that classical music has a very wide dynamic range. If we have something like a heavy rock track, for example, then typically heavy rock has a very narrow dynamic range. And in fact, most commercial popular music of all genres has a really, really narrow dynamic range, and perceptions of dynamics within the track tend to come from things other than actual changes in LUFS level. So historically, when we look back at, say, 70s music and 60s music, it had a wider dynamic range. It was less compressed and less loud than contemporary music. So pretty much in the last 10 years or so, we have had some of the loudest masters in the history of recorded music, and it's quite dramatic if you were to put those masters alongside, say, a master from the 1970s. I mean, the difference in loudness is absolutely massive. So the thing to get here is that dynamic range and loudness have a relationship to musical style and genre. So there's been a lot of talk about the loudness wars. The idea of the loudness wars is that tracks compete with each other in the commercial marketplace for apparent loudness. And so with each new release, mastering engineers, or it's usually the client or the label, wanting that particular release for that artist just to sound louder than all of their competitors. Okay, and that there's this sort of somewhat misguided sense that if the track sounds louder, then it will also sound better, when usually the reverse is true. The more that we use tools to make things louder, the higher the risk is that we actually detract from the audio quality of the mix. It's very hard to make things extremely loud without damaging the audio. So on this slide, you can see a very famous track, Michael Jackson's Black or White. There's a 1991 release here, which is the original release, and you can see it was remastered in 1995 and it got a bit louder again, so it was remastered by someone so that it was more compressed and more limited, and then it was remastered again in 2007 and you can see that it was louder again and more compressed and limited. And you say, well, why is this? Well, the reason is that in each of these years, they were mastering this 1991 track according to the loudness standards that were around in those years. So in order to sound competitive in 1995, the track needed to be mastered louder than it was in 1991 when it was originally done. And likewise, to sound competitive in 2007, it had to be mastered louder again. And with each of these increases in loudness comes a cost to audio quality. So the loudness wars is not a good thing. The loudness wars is a problem from an audio quality perspective, because in getting tracks super loud, we actually cause damage to the sound of the audio. And so there's been a concerted effort across the industry in the last 5 years or so to try and deal with loudness and to try and find ways of navigating away from this super competitive environment where people are making overly loud masters as a way of competing with each other.